Sonny Liston is, quite frankly, an enigma as a person. He didn't talk much about himself. He didn't ever write a biography or anything like that. And he didn't live long enough to have any sort of memoirs or interviews where he could look back on his life and tell us, what he was thinking at the time or how he changed his thinking over time, which has sort of led to him becoming this amazing cult figure because he died so young and so little was known about him. Two of the most interesting things about him are that we don't know when he was born and we don't know when he died. We know roughly when he died and we can guess at when he was born, but, those are the sort of details that you normally have about someone in the public eye, and they're not at all known about Sonny. Liston was also a villain for most of the time that he was alive, but has sort of been recast in some stories as a victim of, an abusive childhood and the people that surrounded him. He was very much surrounded by, quote-unquote, the criminal element. And whenever you're reading any book on Liston, there's always either, we'll always lean either one way or the other. He'll either be a victim of circumstance or just a big nasty bastard. And I think, having read as much as I can on Liston and his life and people who've known him, I don't feel any better off in a position to judge which one he was. I think there's no reason it can't be both. I don't think there's any possible way you can claim that he wasn't just a big nasty bastard. He could be a big nasty bastard and a victim of his circumstances, but an awful lot of his life is made up of violence and his ability to commit violence and intimidate people, and he committed a lot of nasty crimes as well. And not all of those are him being a victim of his circumstance, because by the time that he's committing some of these crimes, he's very much a wealthy man who can look after himself. One of the interesting stories that is often brought up about Sonny Liston, I think it was Thomas Hauser, it might have been David Remnick, a couple of the more famous biographers of Muhammad Ali, when they were conducting interviews with Ali, he had them at his mansion in the 1980s, and he only recently retired from the fights with Larry Holmes and Trevor Berbick. But this biographer was sitting with Ali in front of the fireplace, and he said that Ali went quiet for a moment, looked into the fire, and then turned to him and said Sonny Liston was the devil, apropos of nothing. Which, I like that story because it's a little bit creepy, and there's a lot of allusions to Sonny Liston being like in Fargo, the first series of the TV show, where you've got the Billy Bob Thornton character is sort of a force of nature, and you're not sure if he's supernatural or not. And there's something of that with Sonny Liston. His ability as a fighter is, you can get so good as a normal person training to be a fighter and learning the skills of fighting, and then there's stuff that you could just never make up for not being born with. And Sonny Liston is born with all of these physical attributes that make him abnormally good at fighting. But as we said, Sonny Liston's date of birth is a complete mystery. He's part of an enormous brood. No, what's the correct term? Plural of children. His father's a chap called Tobe Liston, and he has a first life. He has a first wife called Cora, and with them he has allegedly 12 children. And then he meets, after I believe Cora dies, he meets Helen, who is Sonny's mother. And with Helen he has 13 children, and Helen has a previous child from outside of the marriage called E.B. Ward, who she sends away because she's concerned that Tobe will mistreat him or not accept him as his own son. So altogether that comes to about 25, 26 children not of Tobe Liston, but of that extended family. So Sonny gets a little bit lost in the scrabble. He's one of the youngest of the children. I think he might be the youngest, but the estimates are all over the place on this. And the reason is because Arkansas doesn't really care about the birth certificates of the rural black population. Later on, Arkansas has a policy of you can retroactively acquire a birth certificate if you weren't given one when you were born. But you can pretty much just make up your own date because there's nothing to prove that you weren't born on that date. If you can roughly prove that you were around at a certain time, you can get your birth certificate printed with the date on, and that's what Sonny Liston ultimately does. Liston changes his date a few times during his life. He believes he was born in March 1932. That's the date that he uses when he applies for his boxing license later on. But he also thinks that he was born in 1933 and says that in interviews at points. His mother says January 1932, and at one point Liston says she'd know better, she was there. But then he also contradicts her later on. One writer searched through the census and found that Liston wasn't listed on the... Sonny wasn't listed on the 1930 census, but he was listed on the 1940 census as 10 years old, so he could have been born in late 1930. So there's only a few years off in this. It becomes exaggerated when Chuck Wepner fights Liston in what would be Liston's last fight. Liston was supposed to be 37, 38, and Wepner's convinced that he was almost 50. It's a bit like Archie Moore or Henry Armstrong. Archie Moore is the interesting comparison because Archie Moore had tremendous fun allowing the press to speculate over his age. He would lead them to believe that he was older than he was. He was happy for them to think that he was going on 40, going on 50, whenever, because it added to the mystique and the magic of it. And he didn't seem to really care that he didn't have an exact date for his birth. Sonny Liston was a lot more sensitive about it. He was quite upset about the fact that he could never actually place a year on his birth. He didn't like being asked about it in interviews. One writer, this is the age of flowery boxing writers and new journalism, but one writer suggested that, Sonny Liston's entire life is a search for identity and other people buying out parts of him, and the fact that he couldn't even place an age on himself meant that he was just forever lost without this full understanding of his own identity. Now, Sonny Liston, being the youngest of the Liston children, Tobe Liston is... Well, there's not a lot written about him, but what you can read about him, he sounds like a bit of a bastard. He believed that he didn't really believe in schooling, that he would allow the kids to go to the church house to be schooled when there wasn't any farming to be done. But he was a sharecropper, and he believed that, if you were big enough to walk, you were big enough to get outside and work. And so Sonny starts with backbreaking labour very young. Now, Tobe is himself quite a diminutive figure. He's only 5'5", most accounts put him as. He's not a big man. He's certainly nothing in him suggests that Liston would come from him, Sonny that is. And it's always interesting to see men like Charles Liston, Sonny Liston, go on to be so haunted by the spectre of their father. In his mind, Tobe Liston was always going to be gigantic and the man who beat him savagely, even though had they met as adults, there was no chance that Tobe Liston was going to be putting a hand on Sonny. Sonny grew fast, and Tobe was into his 60s when Sonny was born. So any beatings that Sonny remembers, it's suspected came very young. But you almost see it in some of the old boxing footage. It's remarked on in his autopsy, but Sonny's back is covered in scars and things. So Tobe, it's pretty much suspected that Tobe beat him fairly viciously. Liston doesn't talk about his father often. It's not like one of those stories that we're all too familiar with in boxing or any other sport, really, where they fall out with their father, and then when they win a world title or whatever, they bring their father along to an event and they make up and they're seen to be publicly friends again. Liston doesn't say anything about his father except the only thing that my dad gave me was a good whooping. Hated the man, it seems. And it sounds like Tobe was pretty difficult to live with, even if you were stuck in place, pumping out child after child, year after year, as Helen Liston was. She eventually left, and the young Charles and several of his siblings were left with Tobe alone, working as sharecroppers in the backwaters of Arkansas.